Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and will our panel please come to the stage at this moment. I'm Artem Anisimov. I'm today's new generation master moderator. I'm a space lawyer and a licensed attorney in New York State, working for a company called New Space Global, which is an information services provider that tracks and analyzes business and financial activity of new space companies. The long-term sustainability of space is a topic of interest for both the governments and the industry, and is a subject of debate in numerous international bodies. The Space Foundation is pleased to partner with the Secure World Foundation to organize our next panel, and are happy to welcome back to the symposium a long-time friend of the foundation, Dr. Michael Simpson. Dr. Simpson, we're looking forward to the panel.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I used to think that the hardest speaking slot in any symposium was right after lunch. Speaking after hospitality night also has its challenges.
Oh, I'll just tap it. Good enough.
I am Michael Simpson. I am the executive director of the Secure World Foundation. We're proud to be a partner with Space Foundation in looking at issues of long-term sustainability of space activities. The Secure World Foundation is barely 10 years old, but we have worked during that period of time on issues ranging from mitigation of threats from near-Earth objects, and are at a point where we're feeling some success and hope to see a General Assembly resolution on our work this coming fall. We are working on space situational awareness, have played a large partnership role in the early thinking about the Space Data Association, and certainly have been very active in supporting its work. We also work on the part of sustainability that we sometimes forget, and the part that Dr. Werner's remarks yesterday may have helped us to remember. And that is that the question of why is always an important question when we're dealing with how we invest our time and resources in the space sector. For us, the why is that space has become increasingly important to human well-being. Well-being certainly here on Earth for the 7 billion plus of us, so many of whom depend in one way or another, often without realizing it, on space assets. Important for the 3 to 6 of us that live in that small village we have orbiting a few hundred miles above us. And maybe eventually important for those of our species who will live somewhat further away from this beautiful home planet of ours. But we do need to keep in mind that we seek to have sustainable use of outer space because we on Earth have come to depend on outer space, because the creativity of people in many, many countries, many disciplines, many walks of life is increasingly focused on ways that space can make life better, can make disasters less severe, can make relief of human suffering more possible. So as you listen to our speakers today, as you listen to the ideas they present about what the future may hold, I hope you keep in mind that important issue of why we're doing this. We have benefited enormously in the last 56 years since Sputnik from this extraordinary rush of ideas and applications that have gone to space. We want the next generation to do that. As I once heard a chief of the United Nations say, we do not inherit our benefits from our parents. We borrow them from our children. And so let us sustain in that frame of mind. Your panel today is a collection of some extraordinarily knowledgeable people in the challenges of using outer space, and people who spend a considerable amount of time looking at how to continue the benefit and access to outer space. Jim Simpson, the Vice President of Business Development at Boeing Space and Intelligence Systems. Jim, we don't know who that common ancestor of ours might be, but I do thank you for representing the intelligent branch of the family here today. Kazuto Suzuki, a professor of political economy at Hokkaido University and a research fellow at Princeton University. Kazuto and I have worked in a number of contexts together. We're both members of the International Academy of Astronautics, and both, interestingly, call ourselves professors of political economy. For those of you who don't understand, an economist is someone who studies the workings of the economy. A political economist is someone who tries to figure out why the economy is not working. And so you can imagine that Kazuto and I have had some great discussions in on that regard. Sears is here, a president of Intelsat General, and a representative of one of the executive members and founding members of the Space Data Association. A woman who has certainly a fair amount of orbiting assets that she has to be thinking about regularly, and we wish you great luck sustaining them over the years. And Ambassador Jacek Bylica is here. He is the principal advisor and special envoy for non-proliferation and disarmament of the European External Action Service of the European Union. His responsibilities extend over a wide-ranging technical area, but do in fact include special responsibility for the European Union's responsibilities in space policy that they have acquired since the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty in 2009. And to begin our presentations, without any nepotism or family favoritism, Jim Simpson.
Actually, I was thinking about changing my speech to the effects of nepotism in space, but thank you. With the topic of long-term sustainability of space and the practices in the future relative to how we embrace international participation, I think one of the things when I put together the presentation that you're going to see, I started looking at it as we have many examples of very good things we've done together in space. The problem is that it's examples and it's not a routine effect that we've got going on. And I think for us to be effective in the future, sustainability means something more of a routine nature rather than an event nature. And so if we could go to, I'm the one that does this, huh? We'll go to the next chart. So part of the things that we've been focusing in on is obviously the economics associated with space as far as how do we make it more affordable, how do we get capabilities that we currently have for lower prices or better capabilities for more economically than we are doing it now. And there's multiple ways to be able to do something like that to ensure the affordability. We have to be able to expand different acquisition approaches. We need to, some of the things that we're doing in commercial activities really are benefiting multiple ways, whether it be just government or from a commercial perspective. And that word commercial is used all the time. And what does it actually mean? And I'll try to explain that a little bit, at least on my thought process going forward. A lot of people talk about commercial and that we want to be commercial, but the issues are that our policies aren't quite in sync with some of the things that we could do from a commercial perspective. And then finally, how do we leverage the international partnerships that have done some spectacular things in space to make that space more routine and more effective? So here's some of the examples. And again, when I did this, they're great examples, but it's not a uniform approach that we take going forward. And I think that the key going forward is really going to be able to make this part of a routine event. One of the things that we've done is on a wideband global SATCOM system, that the same system that we use for vehicles 1 through 7 or 6, we've procured commercially a commercial type of contracting approach. Same capabilities, same system, same reliability, same availability, but we were able to save the US government effectively $80 million per satellite. So for that, for the same abilities, or actually better abilities than previously, the cost of doing that type of business was effectively, for this a 7 through 10, roughly $240 million cheaper. We also are doing work where there are commercial ways to do that same type of an approach. And so with Inmarsat, one of our international commercial suppliers, we actually have developed an approach that allows them to switch from commercial Ka-band to military Ka-band to be able to provide capabilities for government providers or customers, as well as commercial customers. So again, another example of how we can do those type of things. The third example, in which we've been working with Kay and her team on, is hosted payloads. And the successful IS-22, a UHF payload that for the Australian Defence Forces, that by Intelsat being able to package effectively a UHF system that is seamless with the ground infrastructure that we currently have available, was able to provide the Australians the same type of capability for about 40% less than they would have had to do with a dedicated system. So again, this was an event, but this event, if it made it more routinely, could make us much more effective from a space perspective. And then finally, the public-private partnerships, the activities that were done through Astrium and Paradigm and the UK and the European Union. This is an enormously effective approach in how you can do long-term leasing, long-term contracting to enable you to have the economics of a commercial system and a service for the future. So again, the question of what does the government control versus what you could do from private industry, this public-private partnership is another example of how an international approach could be utilized. So this chart is really wordy. But the issue, though, that we wanted to bring, and I talked about it a bit, is that there are ways to do this. There are ways to leverage commercial processes and practices, eliminating this, reducing the size of the program offices, reducing the amount of deliverable items, but not reducing the types of quality and availability instilled. Building the first satellite in a very development type of a program is much different than when you're in a routine production mode. When you are in a routine production mode, you don't need the same amount of testing each time, but you need the appropriate amount of testing each time. And what we're able to do is provide exactly the same type of availability we've done on the previous WGS satellites, but again, a substantial amount of savings. Finally, one of the things that we found is that national space policy has been encouraging these kind of commercial and international entities to work together, but the actual amount of how do we implement that policy has been extraordinarily difficult for us to do. And if we can work better in trying to get policy and process in sync, I think we can be extraordinarily effective in making these examples more of a routine event in the future. Obviously, some of the things that we can do to change the economics is embrace more utilization of foreign launch vehicles, i.e. the Arianespace systems and others. We look at approaches for long-term leasing instead of yearly leasing, which encourages more of a commercial influence and application to space. Again, making it much more easy to enter into space and making it more routine from a commercial perspective. And there are other things that we can do from a policy perspective. The bottom line is, we've got all the pieces in place, we just haven't built the puzzle yet. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jim. I think sometimes we do forget that cost control and cost management is a part of sustainability, and thank you for making sure that was brought to the fore. Our next speaker is Kazuto Suzuki.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I'm Japanese, and I thought that I was supposed to talk about the Japanese space policy, but well, yesterday Mr. Inoue and Mr. Kozawa has already covered extensively about what Japan is doing and how things are working. So I think I'm changing my hat and trying to speak as a policy guy or political economy guy to explain what's going on in the international side. Unfortunately, I need one full semester to talk about why economy is not working. So I'm not going to talk about it, but still, the question about the issues of the sustainability in the outer space is also an issue requires another semester to talk about. But in a very brief remark on the what's going on in the international arena on the question of sustainability is that there are several several activities going on. One is the group of governmental experts organized by the United Nations. And also the European Union, perhaps Ambassador Bylica will talk about it, the Code of Conduct, which is now turning into an international Code of Conduct under with the negotiation with the European Union, United States, Japan, and Australia. And also the UN COPUOS, it has a long-term sustainability working group, which is working on to set up some sort of ground rule for how to maintain the sustainability of the Earth's orbit. So there are plenty of things going on, and this year will be a remarkable year to get responses or the final outcome of these negotiations, and hopefully we will see some sort of international convergence of the interest or the awareness of the necessity of maintenance of the stabilizing the Earth orbit. However, as a non-American perspective and currently residing in the United States, I think I always face the sort of a different temperature on how people regard in the United States and outside of the United States. On the one hand, the United States is by far the largest user of the Earth orbit, and of course the dependency on both military and the civilian and commercial activities on space is much, much greater than any other country in the world. Of course, Japan, Europe, Russia, China, India, many countries are using space, but the degree to the dependence on the socio-economic and the military importance of space is quite different. Therefore, the interest of maintaining the Earth orbit is quite different. Although there are increasing dependency on space of non-American countries as well. Japan has as you heard yesterday, Japan has recently changed the Japanese space policy and established a basic space law, and now Japan is involving a lot in the process of these international negotiation on establishing ground rules for the international governance on Earth orbit, and also Europe taking an initiative on as a leader of the Code of Conduct. And also, interestingly, there are a variety of activities going on at the regional level. Japan and Australia are now taking quite a few steps to organize the Asian countries. Asian countries basically are very distant from these sort of issues because they were not mostly the traditional spacefaring nations, apart from Japan, China, and India. But gradually, there are a lot of countries are involving in these negotiations because of the increasing usage of space for disaster monitoring and telecommunication, navigation, and many other things. So Japan and Australia taking the initiative to organize a space security session in the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is the only multilateral regional security forum, and also APRSAF, Asia Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum, which is also a group of the space agencies and the space ministries involving in space policy of the Asian countries. So these are one of the process that I'm familiar with about how to spread the idea and collect the interest of the different countries, particularly the non-traditional spacefaring nations. These activities has began particularly after the 2007 Chinese ASAT test. And as you may know, that Chinese ASAT test has just increasingly polluted the Earth orbit with lots of space debris. And also 2009, the collision of the Cosmos and Iridium has made another incident that polluting the Earth orbit, and many countries starting to realize how the significant increase of the risk of the collision of their active satellite, which is very much beginning to be the most important infrastructure for the economic and political social well-being. So I think these carried a very important messages or warning for the many countries, including particularly the United States, but also non-US countries, which are increasingly depending on the space assets. And finally, I think these changes are now taking at more wider areas apart from Asia. We had a very interesting conference at Addis Ababa of the African nations who are also using space and talking about the space sustainability. And also there are a group of countries from Latin America who are also interested in using space and now beginning to pay attention to the question of the space sustainability. So again, I think these discussions and international negotiations is now taking place, and what we need is the leadership. And hopefully the United States, as the largest user of the space assets, will take a leadership together with Europe, Japan, Australia, and India. And eventually these collaboration and convergence of the awareness of the importance will push many other countries to comply with the rules which will be set by the United Nations and through the International Code of Conduct. Thank you.
Thank you, Kazuto. So, Kay, you got to run this whole stable of satellites. Why don't you tell us what that does for your perspective and how you see practices in the future?
Okay, thanks, Mike. So, as Intelsat, I think we're obviously completely dependent on space. So the health of space, the sustainability of space is clearly a very important objective for us. I do think it's a shared responsibility. I think it's operators, it's manufacturers, launch providers, any space-based service provider. So both international and here in the US. Sometimes I think we overemphasize the role that the military has to play in this, but truly it is a shared responsibility. And I don't think one group can tackle this. So let me tell you a few things that affect us as an operator. Certainly our customers depend on our satellites to be there and to work, so continuity of service and the reliability of our fleet is really our number one concern. That is an economic concern as well as from our customers' perspective. So ensuring that we can continue to provide those critical services is where we focus a lot of our attention. What we experience today in terms of how that is disrupted the most is probably radio frequency interference. So we spend a lot of time and a lot of capital putting in RFI mitigation and to detect and to quickly mitigate. We're still dealing primarily with unintentional RFI. 99 times out of 100, this is just somebody who doesn't know how to point their antenna correctly, or they've gotten off track. But it is a very growing problem for all operators. As space becomes more populated and the use of frequencies become very interdependent, we're seeing a lot more RFI, and we're working with our partners in space to resolve that. A new element, probably within the last 5 years, is the cyber component of this and how cyber could affect our continuity of service. I would say that Intelsat gets about 400,000 denial of service attacks each year. And so we have built up quite a hefty IT department that focuses on that. And I would say just 5 years ago, that was probably not as much of a consideration, but it is very critical to us now. Next to the reliability of our system is certainly the safety of flight issue, which encompasses that reliability. We have formulated at Intelsat over the last 50 years some pretty good best practices as to how to fly our fleet, how to have the checks and balances, but also how to integrate the automation that's available, which does take some of the human element out of flying our spacecraft. It's a very critical process, and we fly about 85 spacecraft today with about 7 people. So the level of automation that we've been able to achieve has been remarkable. It's certainly helped the economic factor as well, and we are passing some of those best practices on to our military friends and to our international partners. So we do need responsible operators, and Intelsat is trying to do our part with that. We've also formed the Space Data Association. Mike mentioned this in his introductory comments. This is an effort, again, to really improve the data that is provided for conjunction analysis and for maneuvering. We do rely heavily on the military for a lot of that data, especially for the debris data. But the Space Data Association, which is a group of commercial operators and civilian operators, are now exchanging data. Nobody knows where their satellites are better than the operator, so we're exchanging very high quality data, including maneuver data, which is an element that wasn't quite being captured. So I think we're going to have better space operations as it relates to conjunction analysis, and we're going to continue to work with our allies and our military partners to improve that database going forward for all space operators. But events do happen, and we certainly have our share at Intelsat. We had a launch failure in January and had to recover from that. Some of you might remember the Galaxy 15 Zombie Sat incident, where we had a satellite that had lost command and control but was still transmitting, moving across the arc. So these kinds of things happen, and part of long-term sustainability is how do we overcome some of those events, and what are some of the best practices and some of the communication, both formal communication mechanisms that need to be in place in order to overcome events in space. So we've learned some good lessons there. Certainly fleet management is a big part of that. With our launch failure in January, we were able to rapidly kind of reconfigure and continue to serve our customers. We recovered from that event in about 3 weeks. So that's pretty good fleet management. And we need to continue, though, to build communication channels with and between partners and operators, so that as we have things that happen in space that will affect other operators, we can pick up the phone confidently and talk about those events and overcome them. Within the design of our satellites, that's probably another area that we're focusing on. Again, back to continuity of service, we work closely with our manufacturers like Boeing to ensure that we have the right level of redundancy, that we have very good fuel tracking mechanisms so that we don't leave an object stranded in space. And we continue to work with them as a partner to ensure that whatever we're building and launching is going to operate the way that we think it's going to operate. Affordability. So Jim mentioned this, and it is very true. For an operator like Intelsat, if it's not affordable to go to space or to buy spacecraft, then it's not very sustainable for us. I focus on the launch industry here because that is really where we see the potential for high costs. We have a fairly competitive manufacturing side of the business, but our launch industry is dependent on competition. And so we would love to use US launch vehicles. Right now, we don't have an affordable option there, and so we are keeping our fingers crossed with SpaceX. We've given them a contract, and we are supporting their progress along the way. We also use our international partners, Ariane and the Proton, very reliable vehicles, excellent companies, and we have depended on them. And so in the area of launch policy, we would certainly like to see that opened up. We'd like to be able to launch hosted payloads, certain types of military payloads on foreign launchers. And so we'll continue to work the policy side of that to increase our options. Spectrum is another very important resource. I mean, that is the true enabler of space, is spectrum. So spectrum policy is critical for us. How we utilize that spectrum, how we divide it up among applications and users. We're following this as you look towards the WARC, the next World Radio Conference. There's some pretty critical spectrum debates going on that will affect us. So we work with our US State Department to form what is hopefully a united front. But there is clearly some spectrum issues that need to be dialogued, and we need to have a clear policy between commercial and military spectrum and how that's going to be used. My personal belief is that we should be leveraging both commercial and military spectrum on our satellites. It helps you avoid some of the issues that I've mentioned, including RFI. It helps you to be more resilient and certainly more sustainable. New technology, I think this is another area that could help with the long-term sustainability of space. Intelsat has expressed our support for some of the in-orbit missions, both the MDA and the Vivisat concepts of in-orbit refueling and also doing some basic fixing of satellites or antennas or solar panels, those types of things. We believe that technology is almost here, and there is a low-risk option for how to go about testing some of those things. So we'd like to see those companies successful, and I think we'll be a consumer of in-orbit operations to continue our satellites. Most of our satellites are deorbited simply because of fuel. It's not because we've lost capability or we have no redundancy. It's mostly because of fuel. So we would like to see certainly the refueling move forward. Debris cleanup, again, back to, this is all of our responsibility. So the whole idea of safety and deorbiting to the right levels and at the right time, very important for us, and certainly something that we take very seriously. But what if we have bad actors in space? I think that is something that we have to talk about as well. Not everybody is going to take these best practices and put them to use. So I personally believe there should be consequences for bad actors in space. Purposeful jammers should lose their orbital rights. People who don't deorbit their satellites and get them out of the belts should be, forced to pay for a tow truck to take them out of space if we have one, which I think we will in the next 5 years. So those are some of the consequences, and I could see the insurance industry getting involved in this as well. So there's a lot of great technology that's being developed. There are certainly some amazing best practices, and there's good communication that's happening on this subject. So I appreciate the panel and the fact that we were able to share some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we've heard a number of perspectives, and in fact, perspectives that are already quite international. We are privileged, however, today to have a practitioner struggling with some of the issues of making policy out of all of these ideas and challenges you've heard. And so, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well,
it's an easier audience than the commission, I think.
Thank you very much. I don't think there is much benefit for a speaker in being introduced as a diplomat to some audiences. I think most audiences outside of the UN, actually, when they hear this, you see faces in the audience, people rushing for exit or quietly dozing off. You may have heard the story of such a presentation where actually in the middle of it, someone in the audience just stood up and started pushing his way to the exit. And so the speaker stopped and looked at him and said, "Excuse me, sir, why are you leaving the room while I'm still speaking?" And the guy said, "I'm sorry, I need to get a haircut." "Well, why didn't you get a haircut before I started speaking? I'm not yet halfway through." "Oh, sorry, sir, but before you started speaking, I didn't need a haircut." So having said that, let me say that my presentation is going to be about 10 minutes. And it is, I'll start with the first point, which is that the EU is a major space power. It is an actor in space. And this applies actually to both the member states. We have 27 member states in the European Union, some of them major spacefaring nations like France, and also to the EU as an institution. For example, the European Space Agency, which I believe was presented to you yesterday, the Director General, I think, of the European Space Agency, had a presentation here about some of the plans. It all boils down to the fact that EU is actually number 2 in space after the US in terms of investment, in terms of a number of space objects. So we contribute to the current congestion in space, but we also suffer from it. And actually, it was a European nation, France, which reported first having suffered from a collision in space. In 1996, a French satellite collided with debris and was badly damaged. The ultimate irony was that it was actually damaged by a debris from a previous French launch in 1986. So this got people in Brussels, Paris, and other places scratching their head and thinking about introduction of some sorts of rules of the road, limitation of space debris, for example. Avoiding the congestion that we now have, or organizing it better. And I believe Professor Suzuki just mentioned some of the initiatives, for example, space degree mitigation guidelines, which were developed in the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS. The logic was that in case we have congestion, we need to have rules of the road, and which need to be broadly followed. To make an analogy with, for example, with automobiles, 100 years ago, there were very few of them. And actually, there were ideas that in front of every car, there could be a person waving a flag, walking, and warning people that the car is coming. Now we have rules of the road. You are supposed to follow some rules. Could we do the same for space? And this obviously should apply to both military and civilian satellites. I mean, regardless of the type of object in orbit, it should be covered by those rules. Is it easy? Well, no, but it makes sense. It does not, however, make sense to make this a European initiative only. I mean, those cannot be European rules of the road in space. It would be as if one day we declare in Brussels that, okay, all European cars all over the world are going to follow a certain traffic rules, okay? So your BMWs and Mercedes are going to follow certain rules of the road. No, I mean, sorry, this won't work. We need a wider buy-in. So we obviously started inside the EU discussing those rules of the road and came to certain conclusions among the 27 member states of the EU. But now, and this was mentioned already, we try to have this on international stage, to have those rules accepted internationally and actually also developed to some extent because we haven't adopted them ourselves. We are talking here about a draft which has been approved by the EU, but it's a project in the making. And we are obviously conscious of other such initiatives internationally, or maybe similar initiatives internationally. And again, some of them were mentioned by Professor Suzuki here. But in our case, let me stress, we are not talking about a new treaty or a new UN law or anything serious like this. I mean, there have been treaties in the past, but it usually takes years and years, if not decades, to develop them. So we are talking here about a voluntary arrangement, a sort of declaration to which you could accede to and say, okay, I think it makes sense, this set of simple rules makes sense, and I want to follow them because they are for our common benefit. And we actually heard very positive noises to this about this from a number of spacefaring nations, which are not necessarily yet comfortable with the exact language of the proposals, but are interested in the idea, in developing this idea and in following up on this. Now, what would be the main elements of this code? And as I mentioned, we are thinking very pragmatically here. It's really the sort of the basic rules of the road thing. It's not about, a huge space treaty. First of all, we obviously need to respect the reality, which is that there are legitimate security interests in space, and those should be accounted for. And yes, we should think about, the existing body of legal instruments and some also voluntary arrangements. Of those I would mention, because I don't think it has been mentioned yet, the so-called Hague Code of Conduct against the proliferation of ballistic missiles, which has a small, basically one-person point of contact in Vienna, and where nations exchange pre-launch notifications of ballistic missiles on voluntary basis. And it is done by the US, it is done by the Russian Federation, it is done by France, UK, other countries, Japan, which basically say, this is the basic information. I'm warning you that there is this launch window, and this is what I'm going to do. Please be aware. And it's a very sort of soft instrument. It's very pragmatic. There's no bureaucracy involved. It used to be actually done by fax. I mean, we in the EU paid for a development of a computer system to do this, because it used to be a simple fax which was forwarded by one person in the Austrian Foreign Ministry in Vienna. What would those rules be? I mean, first of all, avoidance of collisions in space and avoidance of creation of debris. This already the Chinese anti-satellite test of 2007 was mentioned, which created thousands and thousands of new debris. But those things are happening all the time. So avoidance of debris, avoidance of collisions in space, notifications in case you want to do something, notifications before dangerous re-entry. For example, if you would have radioactive substance. And this is, again, taken from real life. You would want to notify countries which might be involved, which might suffer from this. We would think of actually creating some sort of a database, but again, a very soft, light model on voluntary basis. And at the same time, we would envision some sort of a consultation mechanism in case problems develop. And there are some, in the draft, there are some proposals for this. For example, if something is going to fall on your head, probably you would want to speak to the nation from which it originated, or the other way around, for to discuss future, responsibility litigation or so and so. We are pushing or promoting this initiative internationally. And those, as I said, first we had to do this inside the 27 nations of the European Union. Then we went out to other major spacefaring nations, to US, Russia, China, Japan, Canada, Republic of Korea. This has taken a couple of years. This year, we are actually planning major open-ended consultations on the 16th and 17th of May in Kiev, Ukraine, co-hosted with the Ukrainian Space Agency, and over 100 nations are invited. Basically, most of UN members are expected to attend, to discuss not the exact language, but rather the main concepts which are there in our draft. And then we'll take it from there. Depending on how broad the support will be, what will be the major criticism or ideas, we will think of maybe floating another draft text or adjusting the one we currently have. So summing up, we think in Brussels that this is a response to a real issue. We want a very light, pragmatic response, not developing another UN treaty. We think of a voluntary instrument to which you could accede, would not be legally binding, but would place sort of a political and moral obligation on you once you declare you are going to do this. And we will need a critical mass for this. To come back to the analogy with the traffic rules, they only make sense if most of us abide by them. And that there is some punishment also, even if it's only moral punishment for those who do not follow them. So we will be looking for a critical mass of major spacefaring nations to be comfortable with those ideas, because the benefits can only come if there is a number of nations abiding by those rules. The larger the number of those who would abide by those rules, the bigger the benefits will be. And I will be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank all of you very much. I may have spoken too soon when I said that speaking after the hospitality night was a challenge, because we really do have a rich set of questions that have been pumping into the text number that's been provided. And one of the first questions that came in that I think all of you may have something to say about is how can we make the provision of space situational awareness a truly international cooperation? Obviously, if you're trying to know what's happening in space, it's nice to be looking from multiple places on the planet. It's good for people's trust to know the data is coming from multiple places on the planet. Is there scope for an international space situational awareness activity of some sort, or what's the art of the possible here?
If you'd like, I could start off. Is that there's the beauty of it, of a potential space situational awareness internationally, is we already have a lot of the infrastructure in place that could enable it to happen. We have the international agreements relative to our different nations. We have a commercial infrastructure, in Kay's perspective, way over 50 satellites. SES has over 50 satellites. There is enough satellites out there that, plus military applications, that you could apply neighborhood watch, other types of space situational awareness rather easily and rather economically, because the infrastructure and the requirement for other applications is already there, and this could be an add-on that could be really strengthen our ability to do space situational awareness and do it very economically. So again, it's one of those things where if we could jointly work together, it's something that the infrastructure is there to enable it to happen.
Well, I agree. There are plenty of capability for the SSA as such, but I think the problem is how to share the data, because at the end of the day, there is sort of a division between the military-civilian exchange of data, which is perhaps making it a little difficult for example, a country like Japan, which doesn't have the military capability, but the civilian capability of tracking satellites and monitoring debris. So I think we need to have some sort of arrangement of how to maintain the military secrecy whereas you share the data for the civilian purposes.
If I may interject on that, is that there's been certain pioneering on that subject. If you look at it, GPS is an example of one that obviously has military applications, but obviously is being used internationally around the world. Our linkage to Galileo and others is something that could also be showing an example of how we can foster that type of a capability and have a sharing of government and internet and commercial type of applications.
I agree.
Ambassador, this has been an important issue in Europe where the curtain between civil and military space has traditionally been fairly opaque. And yet recent moves in the direction of SSA have begun to get individual nations involved and even a community interest. Can you comment on that a bit?
Yes, I think EU is much more into obviously civilian applications than military applications, and the two major projects are indeed Galileo, which is the sort of European version of GPS, which is not yet operational, but in principle it's supposed to be a major capability, and also Copernicus, which would be a global monitoring for environment and security systems. So I would say that the stress is mostly on peaceful applications and more discrete military.
Will that make it easier for you to share data?
Why not?
Or
absolutely.
Yeah, good. Jim, there's a series of questions that really seems to be focused in on something where you caught people's attention, and this is on streamlining contracts. People are interested to know how you can minimize government oversight, how you can streamline the process. People want advice, and I guess you're the man to offer it right now.
Well, the advice is that we've already demonstrated. The good news is, I think that, again, I'd like to focus it in on what I'll say production type programs. And what we were able to do on the WGS program and a couple other programs was look at how we do our commercial satellite systems, which also require this type of availability and capability. No one wants their satellite to fail in orbit, whether it be a government satellite or a commercial satellite. There used to be kind of what I'll say a misnomer that we did a different processing for commercial satellites than we did for government satellites. And the answer is they're on the same production line. So what kind of oversight do we need to have? And in a commercial satellites program, we have a program office from the customer that's roughly 5 or 6 very sharp people that are able to make decisions very quickly. We have much less deliverables. And the other aspect that we already have is that the requirements are absolutely well known in advance. So there isn't a lot of changes. We were able to tailor, actually FAR Part 15 in this case, to be effectively a commercial-like contract, which reduced the amount of procedurals from, I think, over 50 to less than 5 on the WGS program. We now have a program office that went from 75 that were in plant at the Boeing company to now, I believe it's 8 people now. And because of that, your decision-making is faster, the amount of paperwork is less. We've agreed to a testing program that's more in line with what we do on a production program. You don't require the multiple amounts of more testing because you've already demonstrated that in the development phase. So all of that is written into the contract, which reduces the amount of oversight, reduces the amount of costs associated with basically deliverable items, and reduces the amount of costs associated with the testing and the production. All of that enables us to provide the exact same capability that we previously had for much better economics. So that lessons learned from a production perspective commercially and applying it to a government contract for a firm fixed price per program seems to be extremely effective for a production type mode.
Thank you. Number of questions shouldn't surprise any of us. Essentially, they all translate into how do we get China into this tent? What is it? What's required of China or of us to get them very active in the space sustainability discussion? So. Kazuto, you get to start this.
Okay. although I'm from Asia, I'm not exactly understand why China is doing such and such. But I think one of the point is that, first of all, as Ambassador Bylica has explained, that it takes many years to establish a legally binding treaty. And if there is no treaty, there is no rule. And that is let all the country doing anything that they want to do. So I think what is, first of all, what is important is to have some sort of a rule and as an agreement of the major spacefaring and major space users, which is perhaps based on the International Code of Conduct. And this is not legally binding, but I think it would set up the international standard and which would embarrass China not to comply with it. And if you look at, for example, after 2007, there was a strong international criticism of what China did. And eventually, well, in 2010, China also did some sort of ASAT test, but it was following the American practice of shooting down the satellite as a missile defense, and which is very low orbit, so that it wouldn't create a huge debris cloud. So I think these sort of international practices, as well as the international pressure, will make some sort of constraints on what China does in space.
Okay. Any other? Ambassador?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't like to use the word constraints, actually. I think, Chinese have a major space program, very sort of thought through, far-reaching, ambitious, and I think so far quite successful. At the same time, I believe that they are being ambitious, at the same time, they are very pragmatic. And if they see benefit in the system, they would support it. And we see this in a number of other portfolios. I mean, I've been dealing with non-proliferation issues for a number of years. And we see a steady progress of China joining international instruments and supporting them and being a responsible player in multilateral fora. So I think the tendency is clearly a positive tendency. And I believe that the Chinese government, Chinese businesses, when they will see benefit in sort of supporting the system or joining the system, they will go there. They will join this. It might take maybe longer than some of us would wish, but I think the tendency is clearly in this direction, and it's a positive tendency.
It's something of a related question. In the early days of discussion of the Code of Conduct, one of the countries that was most concerned with the feeling that maybe it had not been consulted enough was India, the largest space power that is not on the permanent member of the Security Council. What are your thoughts about ensuring that India, which is a launching state capable of producing its own payloads, is also actively involved in this process?
I mean, India is a major spacefaring nation and is sort of an example of great progress that could be made in this area. It will be consulted. We are open to consultations. They are invited. I mean, I've been actually following this portfolio for only 1 month, so I haven't been to New Delhi yet. I mean, I have had extended discussions both with the U.S. government and with the Russian government on these issues, but India is still ahead. But we are inviting them to all the meetings on this subject, and obviously their voice will be a very important voice.
Thank you.
Well, I think yes, you're right that India initially not so happy with the European initiative because it was, well, from Indian perspective, I think they thought that the international rules are decided outside of the consultation of India. And I think the question of ownership is quite important because this is a non-legally binding rules, and in order to everyone to comply with the non-binding rule, you need to have the sort of a sense of ownership. And I think gradually India understood that this is just a draft of international code of conduct, not just European imposing the rule to India. So this process of internationalization of code of conduct has made India more positive to the process.
Indeed, if I may come back to this again, I mean, somebody has to start. I mean, as with any initiative, I mean, somebody has to take the initiative. It just happened that it was the EU which took the initiative, and due to the fact that it's an organization of 27 member states, it took some time, you know, for us to discuss it internally. But as we do this in a sort of a transparent manner, we are not a very secretive organization. Everybody knew that, you know, the EU is cooking up something. This might have created a bad image, but obviously we are not in the business of imposing any rules on anyone else. The EU has a great tradition of norm setting, of gradual development of different norms and standards in industry and so on, which some of them have been used internationally too, because they simply make sense. And I hope that this is also this case. I mean, a small interesting thing about India is that actually the only book on this initiative that I came across has been published in India. I mean, we still do not have a code, but we already have an Indian book about the code, which is titled, I think, Decoding the International Code of Conduct, or Decoding the European Code of Conduct. So there
I
is
actually
interest.
contributed to that volume.
Kay, here's a question that perhaps you could start off with and others can then chime in. It deals with the Space Data Association, and it's a question I hear a lot. It's why should other operators subscribe to this? It has no information on debris that anyone else could get. And of course, one of the points you made was that there is the ephemeris data and the maneuvering data. So maybe you could describe that a little bit more so people understand what the differences are.
Sure. So the current structure of the Space Data Association is that the operators contribute their data, and the contractor that sits in the middle, who's AGI, receives that data. It's all kept very proprietary, and they create the products and the warnings that would come back out to the members of the SDA. But another important component of that is that they are also taking and running this by the Air Force and the catalog itself. We don't get that data at this point in time. We're working on that, but we do compare it. AGI compares it to that. So the product is a much improved, what I would call warning system for the members of the SDA. And the most important component of that is the maneuver data itself. That is the piece that is adding to this puzzle of data that is being collected and not necessarily in a central source, but the ability to compare that data to what is in the catalog that is maintained by the Air Force. So the incentive for the operator really is more precise conjunction data and having their maneuver data embedded into the products that are being supplied for debris. So I think that's the critical piece.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything on that? Kazuto, this may be a question you could start discussing. There's some question about whether the COPIOS process, that is the COPIOS committees that are looking at long-term sustainability of space activity, COPIOS being the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space of the United Nations, are taking into account the commercial concerns. Particularly of concern is COPIOS's reluctance to step on the ITU's shoes on electromagnetic and RFI issues. So do you want to start off talking about how you think this might integrate with the larger sustainability issue?
Well, that's a tough question. As all governments are, the United Nations is perhaps the most stovepiped organization and the system of international governance. So it is very difficult to overlap the processes of the UN COPUOS to ITU, and even there's something called the Conference on Disarmament and the Prevention of the Arms Race of the Outer Space under the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. And both are dealing with space, but UN COPUOS is for the civilian peaceful purpose, and the CD Paros is the military or security issues, and these two are not coordinating each other. So it is very difficult for combining these activities at the sort of UN or international level. But perhaps what is important is the member states who are participating in those processes to bring ideas and sharing the ideas among all the members and discuss in COPUOS, the Paros, and UN and ITU all together to have a coherence of at the national level. So I encourage not only Japan, but also other nations to have sort of a whole of the government approach for the space security and the sustainability as the single policy objective at the national level, and bring them to the different kinds of international fora.
May I follow up on this? Because this is exactly the point I'd like to make also, and I think in my presentation there was an element of this. This stovepiping of the UN system with COPUOS dealing only with the peaceful uses, then in Vienna, then the conference on disarmament in Geneva, supposedly about prevention of race in outer space. Then there is the group of governmental experts on transparency and security building in space, confidence and security building in space, which is also running in Geneva. And one of the ideas behind the code idea was actually also to bridge these things, because they are interdependent. And in the UN, they are not. What's more, the stovepiping reaches back to national governments, because the people in the capitals which deal with different fora are different people. And quite often they also don't talk, to each other in their capitals. So it is this, you would call it, cross-cutting or interagency or comprehensive approach is one of the benefits of the EU code idea, the idea behind the code. But it's also one of the problems, because we hear, like we discuss with one community in one nation, but another community comes back and criticizes it. It's as I say, it's the benefits and also the challenges are very much visible. So overcoming stovepiping is something which I would support very much.
Well, we come to the point where this magnificent clock in large enough letters for me to easily read, even after hospitality night, is telling me that our time is about concluded. I thank you for being here. I thank you for an extraordinary array of questions, and apologize that I think there were 33, and so we did not get to all of them. But there was a sense, again, of whether we had dealt well enough with the question why. And I just leave you with the understanding that not only are the most developed societies of today's world increasingly dependent for their lifestyle, for their ability to communicate, for their ability to have real-time information, for their ability to navigate, to manage their societies on space assets. But what Romain Bausch spoke of yesterday with the other 3 billion, those folks in active development around the world are increasingly using space to leapfrog certain elements of infrastructure, to have many of the benefits of society that we have come to take for granted. If space becomes inaccessible, if the cost of reaching it becomes overwhelming, those folks are left with a strategy that cannot meet their needs. And so we have a lot of why, a lot of reasons to persist in making space more sustainable, not only for us and for our innovation, but for the rest of our species, it is quite eager to share it. Thank you for being a part of this discussion.